church bell stopped ringing in the middle of a song. A bride in white linen turned slowly at the altar of a small Fort Smith chapel. The pews were full. The groom was not. A waiting murmur ran through the congregation. The bride stood for a long moment with her bouquet of prairie roses in her hands. Then she walked, very calmly, down the aisle past her father and her three sisters and her Aunt Beatrice. She walked out the back door of the chapel. She crossed the dusty churchyard. She walked into the small stable attached to the parsonage and pulled the saddle off the wall peg where her father had hung it that morning. She saddled her father's bay mare with steady hands. She tied her wedding bouquet to the saddle horn with a piece of leather thong. She stepped into the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. She rode out of Fort Smith at noon on the 14th of May, 1882, in a wedding dress on her father's bay mare, with a wedding bouquet at the saddle horn and no plan beyond the next mile. Her name was Hester Wainwright. She was 26 years old. The man who had not appeared at the altar was a Texas Ranger named Lieutenant Caleb Lockwood, age 29, of Company B. He had been engaged to Hester for 2 years. He had not sent a wire. He had not sent a writer. He had simply not appeared. Hester rode 200 miles alone across the Indian Territory in the next 4 days. She rode along the old Butterfield stage road. She rode past Spiro and McAlester and Atoka and Strington. She slept in 3-way stations. She ate biscuits and pieces of jerked beef from a small canvas sack she had tied behind the cantle of the saddle that morning. She did not speak more than 4 sentences to any of the way station keepers. On the 4th afternoon, at a way station on the Canadian River called Riley's Crossing, a federal marshal named Sheriff Tom Doyle caught up with her. Tom Doyle was a careful man of 50. He had ridden out of Fort Smith 2 hours after the wedding. He had been her father's hunting partner for 15 years. He found her at the way station, eating a bowl of stew at a long pine table with the way station keeper. He sat down across from her. He looked at her face for a long, quiet moment. He said, "Hester." She set down her spoon. She said, "I am going to find him." He said, "I know." He paused. She said, "He is in Las Cruces. The ranger company has been there for 6 weeks. I have the wire from his captain in my pocket. The wire was sent to my father the morning of the wedding. The wire arrived in Fort Smith 2 hours after the wedding. My father read it. He told me. I left." Tom Doyle drew a slow breath. "What does the wire say?" he said. She handed him the folded paper from her saddlebag. He read it. The wire said, "Regret to inform that Lieutenant Caleb Lockwood, Company B, was killed in the line of duty in Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory on the 11th of May, 1882, in a gunfight with the Lopez gang. Body recovered. Funeral pending arrangements. Captain William Barrett, Texas Rangers, Company B." Tom Doyle looked up. "Hester," he said. "I know," she said. "I read the wire. I know he is dead." She looked at him steadily. "I am riding to Las Cruces because I would like to attend my fiancé's funeral," she said. "I will not arrive in a wedding dress. I have a packed traveling case at the way station. I will change clothes tomorrow morning. I have a black morning dress in the case. I had been planning to wear it for the train ride east on our honeymoon. I will wear it now." She paused. "I would also," she said quietly, "like to know who killed him." Tom Doyle set the wire down. He looked at her face for a long time. She did not yet know that what he was about to find in her saddlebag would change the manhunt completely. She did not yet know that a Pinkerton operative would arrive at her boarding house in Veneta that night with a second warrant, bearing her maiden name listed not as victim, but as accomplice. Why had Lieutenant Caleb Lockwood died in a gunfight in Las Cruces? Stay with me on this one. Hester Wainwright had been born in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in 1856. Her father, Judge Elias Wainwright, had been a federal district court judge for 25 years. Her mother, Margaret Wainwright, had died in childbirth in 1860 with Hester's youngest sister. Hester had been raised by her father, with the help of her Aunt Beatrice and a procession of housekeepers, in a tall white house on the bluff above the Arkansas River. Hester had been the oldest of 4 sisters. She had been the careful, quiet one. She had read every book in her father's library by the age of 16. She had taught herself to ride at 20, to shoot a rifle at 21, and to do the household ledgers at 22. She had not married young. She had met Caleb Lockwood in the spring of 1880, when she was 24, at a dance in the courthouse hall. He had been 27. He had been a Texas Ranger on leave, in Fort Smith on a courtesy assignment to escort a federal witness. He had been a tall, quiet, polite man with sandy hair and gray eyes. They had danced 4 dances that night. They had written letters for the next 8 months. He had returned to Fort Smith twice in 1880 on leave. He had asked her to marry him in November of 1880 in the parlor of her father's house. She had said yes. They had been engaged for 18 months. The wedding had been postponed twice. Once because his ranger company had been deployed to chase the Garcia gang in late 1881. Once because Hester's grandmother had died in February of 1882, and the family had observed a 60-day mourning period. The wedding had finally been set for the 14th of May, 1882. The 14th of May, 1882, was the day Lieutenant Caleb Lockwood had been buried in a hot, dusty cemetery in Las Cruces, 3 days after his death, while his bride waited at the altar in Fort Smith. Hester had been told, by the half hour before the ceremony, that Caleb's train had been delayed at Texarkana. She had been told the rider with the wire had not yet arrived. She had been told there had been a heavy thunderstorm in Texas that had washed out the rail bridge at Marshall. She had walked down the aisle on her father's arm at noon. She had stood at the altar for 20 minutes. The minister had finally pulled her father aside. Her father had read the wire that had been handed to him on the church steps 2 minutes earlier. Her father had walked back to her at the altar. He had taken her hand. He had told her quietly that Caleb was dead. Hester had stood at the altar for 1 more long minute. She had set her bouquet down on the altar rail. She had taken her father's hand off her arm. She had walked down the aisle alone and out of the chapel and into the stable and onto her father's bay mare and out of Fort Smith. She had ridden 200 miles in 4 days. The first day she had ridden until the stars came out. She had stopped at a way station called Cooper's Hollow Run by an old man with a glass eye who had asked her no questions. She had paid for a bowl of beans and a corner of the hay barn. She had slept 4 hours in the saddle blanket and risen before dawn. The second day she had crossed a low ridge of pine timber and seen a thunderstorm move along the southern horizon for 6 hours without ever reaching her. She had ridden through 3 small Choctaw settlements where women had watched her from doorways without speaking. She had not slowed. The third day she had ridden through rain. The wedding dress, which had been cream linen with a small lace collar, had darkened along the hem with red territory mud. She had not changed clothes. She had not eaten until evening. She had reached a way station called Pine Creek and slept 3 hours and risen again. The fourth day she had reached Riley's, crossing on the Canadian River at 3 in the afternoon. Now Sheriff Tom Doyle sat across from her at a pine table at Riley's crossing on the Canadian River and looked at her with an expression she could not read. She said, "What is in the saddlebag?" He blinked. "What is in your saddlebag, Hester?" he said. She frowned. "My traveling case is in my saddlebag. My morning dress. A small leather pouch of coins. A daguerreotype of Caleb. A Bible from my aunt." Tom Doyle rose from the bench. He walked to the door of the way station. He looked out at the bay mare where she stood at the hitching rail. He walked back to the bay mare. He opened the right saddlebag. He pulled out a slim leather portfolio. The portfolio was the size of a folded newspaper. It was made of dark brown leather with a small brass clasp. It had a string tie around the middle. Hester rose from the table. She walked out to the hitching rail. She had never seen the portfolio before. She had not put any leather portfolio in her saddlebag. Tom Doyle held it up. He had pulled it out of the bottom of her right saddlebag, under the morning dress. She said, "That is not mine." He nodded slowly. He carried the portfolio back into the way station. He laid it on the pine table. He untied the string. He opened the clasp. Inside the portfolio were 3 folded papers, a small map, and a thin packet of letters tied with a black ribbon. Tom Doyle unfolded the top paper. The top paper was a Wells Fargo bond in the amount of $50,000, issued to bearer, dated April 30, 1882. He set it down. He unfolded the second paper. The second paper was a typed receipt from a bank in Marshall, Texas, dated May 9, 1882, 2 days before Caleb's death. The receipt was for the deposit of $43,000 in gold coin into an account in the name of Caleb Lockwood. Tom Doyle set it down. He unfolded the third paper. The third paper was a handwritten letter from a man named Jorge Lopez to Caleb Lockwood, dated April 22, 1882. The letter said, "I have received the agreed price. The shipment will be at the Las Cruces yard on the morning of May 11. You will arrive with 3 Rangers. You will engage in a brief gunfight with my men. My men will fire wide. You will fire wide. One of my men will be killed for the appearance of authenticity. You will recover the strongbox. The strongbox will contain the federal silver. You will deliver the strongbox to the bank in Las Cruces, and the case will be closed. Your payment will be in the strongbox under a false bottom. Your share is $50,000 in federal silver. Mine is the rest. We will not communicate again. Burn this letter. Jorge." Tom Doyle set the letter down on the pine table. He looked up at Hester. Hester had gone white. She sat down very slowly on the bench across from him. She said, "That is not Caleb's writing." Tom Doyle said, "The letter is from Jorge Lopez, not Caleb. It is signed by Lopez." She said, "That is not Caleb. Caleb would not." She stopped. She did not know what Caleb would or would not. She had been engaged to a man for 18 months. She had known him for 2 years. She had spent perhaps 30 days in his physical presence in those 2 years. She had read perhaps 50 letters from him. She had loved a man she had not lived with, who had spent every working day 3 states away from her, who had been a ranger for 9 years. She did not, in the most honest part of her, know what Caleb would or would not have done. She put both her hands on the table. She breathed. Tom Doyle untied the packet of letters with the black ribbon. The letters were written in the same hand as the Lopez letter. They were addressed to Caleb at 3 different post office boxes in 3 different small Texas towns. The earliest was dated December of 1881. The latest was dated May 5, 1882, 6 days before Caleb's death. The letters described, in careful detail, the planning of the staged Las Cruces robbery. Caleb had been negotiating with Jorge Lopez for 5 months. Caleb had agreed to take $50,000 in federal silver from a Wells Fargo shipment in exchange for a staged gunfight that would clear the Lopez gang of suspicion and let Lopez retire across the Mexican border with the remaining $120,000. Caleb had been planning to use his share of the money to pay off his father's debts. Caleb's father, Hester now remembered, had lost a small cattle operation in Texas in 1879 and had been working as a livery hand in Marshall, Texas, for the last 3 years. Caleb had mentioned the debts only once, in a letter the previous October. He had said his father owed $9,000 to a Galveston bank and could not pay it. He had said it as a small line in a long letter about a Ranger horse he had liked. Hester had not asked about the debt again. Caleb had been planning, after the Las Cruces operation, to retire from the Rangers and marry Hester and move with her to a small ranch in Central California he had been talking about quietly for the last 6 months. Caleb had been killed in the gunfight. The gunfight had not gone according to plan. Jorge Lopez's men had not fired wide. They had fired to kill. Lopez had double-crossed Caleb at the last minute. Lopez had decided, the night before the operation, that the safest move was to kill the Ranger who had been corresponding with him and recover the letters and disappear with all of the silver. Lopez had killed Caleb. Lopez had taken the silver. Lopez had not, however, recovered the letters. The letters, along with the Wells Fargo bond and the receipt, had been in a leather portfolio in Caleb's saddlebag at the Las Cruces yard. Caleb had handed the portfolio to a young ranger named Private Tom Williams that morning before the gunfight, asking him to deliver the portfolio to a courier who would take it east to Fort Smith. Caleb had not told Williams what was in the portfolio. Williams had carried out the order. The courier had been a man named Mr. Hellman, a regular Wells Fargo courier between Las Cruces and Fort Smith. Hellman had reached Fort Smith on the morning of May 14th. He had handed the portfolio, at Caleb's instruction, to the postmaster of Fort Smith with a note, delivered to Miss Hester Wainwright after the wedding ceremony, in private. The postmaster had been on his way to the chapel for the wedding. The postmaster had seen Hester saddling the bay mare. The postmaster had run after her into the stable yard. He had pressed the portfolio into the right saddlebag of the bay mare, while Hester had been fastening the cinch on the saddle. He had not spoken. He had simply pressed it in and run back to the chapel to deliver the news of the canceled wedding. Hester had been on the bay mare and out of Fort Smith within 5 minutes. She had not noticed the portfolio at the bottom of the saddlebag in 4 days. Now she sat on a bench at Riley's crossing on the Canadian River and stared at her dead fiancé's confession. Tom Doyle let her sit. He did not pressure her. He did not interrupt. After a long time she said quietly, "My father will be ashamed of me." Tom Doyle said, "Your father will be very, very proud of you, Hester. Your father has been a federal judge for 25 years. He has seen many things. He will read this portfolio, and he will understand that Caleb Lockwood was a man under terrible pressure, who made a terrible choice in the last 6 months of his life. He will not stop loving Caleb. He will not stop being proud of you for riding 200 miles alone to find him. He will, however, be grateful that the portfolio is in your hands and not Jorge Lopez's." He paused. "There is something else," he said. She looked up. "You did not see," Tom Doyle said carefully, "that I have been riding 2 days behind a Pinkerton operative named Marcus Briggs. Briggs left Fort Smith 3 hours after the wedding on a federal warrant for your arrest." Hester's face did not change. "A warrant for me," she said quietly. "Yes." "On what charge?" "On the charge," Tom Doyle said, "of accomplice to the federal silver robbery of May 11, 1882, in Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory." She stared at him. "I had nothing to do with any robbery," she said. "I know," he said. "The Pinkertons do not know." The Pinkertons received a telegram on the night of the 12th of May from a man named Jorge Lopez. The telegram said, "The Wainwright woman in Fort Smith is the silent partner in the May 11 Las Cruces job. Check her saddlebag." He paused. "Lopez sent the wire," Tom Doyle said, "because he knew you would receive Caleb's portfolio. He had figured out, by the night of the 12th, that the portfolio was missing from Caleb's saddlebag. He knew Caleb. He knew Caleb would have sent the portfolio to you. He decided to make you the federal target. If a Pinkerton found those papers on you, the case would close with your name on it. Lopez would be free. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Stay with me. This is where it turns." Hester sat very still for a long, quiet moment. She said, "Marcus Briggs is how far behind us?" Tom Doyle said, "He was a day behind me when I left Fort Smith. He may be at any time. He is a quiet, careful Pinkerton. He will arrive at this way station tonight or in the morning. He will see the bay mare. He will recognize her. He will arrest you on sight and take you back to Fort Smith in irons." She nodded slowly. "What do we do?" she said. Tom Doyle was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We ride east. Now, you and I. With the portfolio. We do not return to Fort Smith. We ride to Veneta. There is a Methodist boarding house in Veneta run by my late sister's daughter Maddie. Maddie will hide you in a back bedroom for 2 days while I ride on to Veneta's telegraph office. I will wire the U.S. Marshall's office in St. Louis. I will not wire the office in Fort Smith, because Lopez has a man in the Fort Smith office. He paused. I will explain in the wire to St. Louis that I have apprehended Miss Hester Wainwright, that she has voluntarily surrendered the portfolio, that she is cooperating fully with the investigation, and that I am holding her at a safe location pending the arrival of federal investigators. He looked at her. The wire will reach St. Louis in the morning, he said. Federal investigators will be in Veneta by the next afternoon. The portfolio will be in federal custody by supper time. You will be cleared of all charges within 72 hours. She nodded slowly. She set both her hands flat on the table. We ride, she said. They saddled out of Riley's Crossing within 45 minutes. She changed into the black morning dress in the back room of the way station. She buttoned it at her throat and pinned her hair under a small black bonnet. Tom Doyle had checked the cinches on both horses and refilled both canteens. He nodded once when she came out, mounted up, and turned his roan east. They rode east through the spring evening. They stopped at midnight at a spring under a low limestone shelf. Tom Doyle watered the horses. Hester ate 2 biscuits and a strip of dried apple from his coat pocket. They slept 4 hours on saddle blankets without a fire. They rode again before dawn. They made Veneta by supper time on the 19th of May. Maddie was a kind, careful woman of 34 who had been raised by Tom Doyle and his sister. She did not ask questions. She showed Hester to a back bedroom on the 2nd floor of the boarding house. She brought up a tray of cold ham and biscuits and tea. She bolted the bedroom door from the outside, with Hester's permission, and slept on a cot in the hallway with a shotgun across her knees. Tom Doyle rode to the telegraph office. He sent the wire to St. Louis at 8 p.m. on the 19th of May. The clerk read the wire back to him twice. Tom Doyle paid in silver and walked back to the boarding house in the dark. The Pinkerton Marcus Briggs arrived at the boarding house at midnight on the 19th. He pounded on the front door. Maddie opened the door politely. She held a lamp in one hand and the shotgun behind her hip in the other. She told him there were no rooms available. She showed him the small Methodist hotel 2 blocks over. Briggs walked to the small Methodist hotel. He did not search the boarding house. He did not have a warrant for the boarding house. He had a warrant for Hester Wainwright, person, not for premises. He went to bed in the Methodist hotel. He woke in the morning to find that 2 federal investigators had arrived at Veneta on the early train. The federal investigators had carried out a deposition with Hester at the boarding house at 6 in the morning. The federal investigators had taken the portfolio into custody at 7. The federal investigators had wired the U.S. Marshal's office in St. Louis at 8. The federal investigators had then walked over to the small Methodist hotel and informed Marcus Briggs that the warrant for Hester Wainwright had been suspended pending the conclusion of the federal investigation. Marcus Briggs had read the suspension paper carefully. He had nodded. He had taken the next train east, back toward St. Louis. He had, before he boarded the train, walked over to the boarding house and lifted his hat to Maddie at the front door and said only, "Ma'am." Maddie had nodded. He had not asked to see Hester. He had not asked any further questions. He had walked back to the depot and gone home. Hester stayed in the back bedroom of the boarding house for 10 days. The federal investigation moved quickly. The 2 investigators, a senior man named Marshal John Reeves and a junior man named Deputy Sam Carlin, rode south with the portfolio and a copy of the Lopez letters. They wired the Texas Rangers at Las Cruces. Captain William Barrett, Caleb's commanding officer, met them at the Las Cruces yard on the 24th of May. Barrett read the letters. Barrett did not speak for a long time. Then Barrett said only, "I will help you find Lopez." Jorge Lopez was arrested in El Paso on the 27th of May, attempting to cross into Mexico with a strongbox of federal silver. The Texas Rangers took him at a livery stable 2 blocks from the border. He drew his pistol. He did not fire. He was hanged in October of 1882 in Las Cruces. Hester returned to Fort Smith on the 1st of June, 1882, in the company of her father and her Aunt Beatrice and Tom Doyle. Her father had come down to Veneta on the train. He had walked into the boarding house parlor and taken her hand and said only, "Hester." She had said only, "Father." They had sat together for a long, quiet hour without speaking further. Aunt Beatrice had brought a small carpet bag with 3 clean dresses. Hester had thanked her. She did not wear the morning dress on the train home. She wore a simple gray traveling dress and a wool cloak. The town did not speak about the missed wedding. Fort Smith was a federal town with a federal judge in it, and people in Fort Smith understood when a subject was closed. The pews of the chapel were emptied. The bouquet of prairie roses that Hester had set on the altar rail had been carried away by the minister's wife and dried, and pressed into a small leather book. Hester accepted the small leather book without opening it and set it on a shelf in her bedroom, and did not look at it again for 15 years. Hester took up residence in her father's house on the bluff above the Arkansas River. She did not marry. She read every book in her father's library a second time. She read them slowly, in the order they sat on the shelves, beginning with the law books in the front parlor and ending with the small leather volumes of poetry her mother had collected. She made notes in the margins in a careful pencil hand. She did not show the notes to anyone. She learned slowly to forgive Caleb Lockwood. The forgiving was not one act. It was a long, slow process that took 6 years. She walked along the bluff above the river most evenings. She watched the steamboats turn at the bend below the courthouse. She thought about Caleb's father in Marshall, Texas, working as a livery hand at 58 years old with a $9,000 debt. She thought about a man who had loved her, who had wanted to retire to a small ranch with her, who had taken a wrong road to get there. She wrote in 1885, 3 years after the missed wedding, a small, careful pamphlet about her 4 days of solo riding across the Indian Territory in May of 1882. She did not name Caleb in the pamphlet. She did not name Jorge Lopez. She did not name Marcus Briggs. She named only the way stations and the trail and her bay mare and the long, quiet sky above the Canadian River. The pamphlet sold well in 3 Arkansas counties. The proceeds, $604 in federal silver, she gave to the small Methodist boarding house in Veneta, where Maddie still ran her quiet, careful business. Maddie wrote her a single-line letter back. The letter said only, "The back bedroom is yours whenever you wish." Hester kept the letter in the front of her Bible for the rest of her life. Tom Doyle retired from the Marshal Service in 1889. He moved into a small cabin 2 miles upriver from the Wainwright house. He came to Sunday supper at Judge Elias Wainwright's table every week until the judge died in 1898. Hester poured the coffee. Tom Doyle stirred in 2 spoons of sugar. They did not speak of Caleb. They did not need to. In 1903, when she was 47, she traveled by train to Las Cruces. She went alone. She stood for an hour at Caleb's grave. She did not bring flowers. She did not weep. She said quietly the only sentence she had carried 2,000 miles to say, "I forgive you, Caleb." She took the next train east. She did not return to Las Cruces. Hester lived in her father's house for another 40 years. She raised, in those years, the daughters of her 3 younger sisters when those sisters and their husbands moved away or fell ill or needed help. She did not call herself an aunt. She called herself a guardian. She paid for 2 of her nieces to attend college at the University of Arkansas. She paid for one of them, a quiet girl who loved horses, to study veterinary science. The quiet niece, whose name was Margaret after Hester's mother, opened a small practice in Fort Smith in 1915 and treated Hester's last horse, a chestnut gelding named Riley, until that horse died of old age in 1920. She died of pneumonia in the spring of 1922 at the age of 66. She was buried in a small Methodist cemetery on the bluff above the Arkansas River, 3 rows from her mother and her father, with a small flat stone that read, "Hester Wainwright, 1856-1922." She rode the long road well. Margaret, the veterinary niece, paid for the headstone. She had heard the story of the long road only once, from Tom Doyle, the year before he died in 1908. He had told her only the part about the 4 days and the Bay Mare and the way stations along the Canadian River. He had not told her about the portfolio or the warrant or the Pinkerton. Those parts of the story Hester had carried herself, in the quiet way she carried most things, until the end. The federal warrant against her had been suspended, and then quietly expunged in 1883 at the request of Judge Elias Wainwright. The deposition taken at the Veneta boarding house had been sealed. The only mention of Hester in the surviving federal file was a single line in Marshal John Reeves's field notes. Subject cooperated fully, surrendered the evidence of good character, recommend full clearance. It was enough. It was enough.